Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this community conversation related to fair housing. This event was made in collaboration with the Champlain Valley Office of Economic Opportunity, as well as Burlington's Racial Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging Office. I'm very grateful to be here to celebrate Fair Housing Month. As some of you may know, the Federal Fair Housing Act was enacted in 1968 in April. So every April we celebrate Fair Housing Month with events like this, and we come together and we teach people about fair housing and their rights and responsibilities and obligations under fair housing laws. The definition of fair housing is the right to equal opportunity in housing choice and the right to live free of discrimination, whether someone is renting, buying, or financing a home. So here we have lots of housing experts that are going to talk about how they enforce fair housing laws, how they do education and outreach related to fair housing, as well as municipal housing planning and development plans as well. So I'm going to pass it over to Katie Green from the REIB office, who is going to get our panel started.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Katie Green, as Kalia said, and I appreciate everybody who could be here and those who helped support us get this event going. Special shout out to CVOEO. I'll go through and introduce folks. This is Kalia Livingston. She is the Fair Housing Project Education and Outreach Coordinator at CVOEO. And I feel like each of these people deserve a clap after. And this is Big Hartman. They are the Executive Director and General Counsel at the Human Rights Commission. This is Rachel Batterson. She is the Director of Housing Discrimination Law, the Director of the Housing Discrimination Law Project at Vermont Legal Aid. This is Maggie Callahan from the Community Economic and Development Office at the City of Burlington. She is the Housing Program Manager. And this is Kelly Perkins, the Racial Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging Office at the City of Burlington. Dr. Perkins is the director. And before we get started, if anyone needs to scan for interpretation services, you can use the QR code up here, or if folks online can see the URL underneath, you can scan or go to the URL, and it's pretty a good system where you can just like click and it'll either speak to you in your selected language or you can read in your selected language. But with that, I will let Kelly take it away. Thank you, guys.
All right. Thank you so much, Katie, and thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. Again, Kelly Perkins, Director of the Office of Racial Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging for the City of Burlington. And I'm hoping my remarks today really, I want to maybe serve as to accentuate what my fellow panelists are going to share today in the legal policy implementation realms around housing in the City of Burlington, and really just center us so that we're talking about having the same conversation, right? Because it is hard to talk about fair housing without understanding how we got to a place where housing was unfair to begin with, right? And so when we talk about fair housing in the United States, often in today's age, it's framed as a legal issue, but really, housing is a policy issue first in this country. We're talking about power, place, who's been allowed to belong, right? Conversations around housing are very hard because housing is very personal, right? Life is, we would be remiss to not own it, life is in some ways easier, is more bearable when I am struggling, and I could do so behind the closed doors with the safety of my own family, right? As opposed to having to be subject to outdoors to the public, for instance. And so, you know, fair housing really is a policy story, and it's about much about our country's history of discrimination, right? It's not accidental, right? We have had a fair housing issue in this country by design, right? Through the mid-20th century, federal, state, often local systems work together, right, to establish racially segregated communities, right? This is where this issue starts in this country, is one, to keep Black and brown folks out of certain places in our country. One of the most well-known tools that was used was redlining, the practice of labeling neighborhoods, particularly Black and immigrant communities, as hazardous, right, or unsafe for investments, right? Banks refused loans. Insurance companies refused coverage. White families were actively supported, we know, during the 1950s in moving to the suburbs, right, with federal funding behind them. Meanwhile, you know, these weren't isolated acts of bias, you all, right? They're coordinated public policies embedded in maps, in underwriting standards, and in land use decisions. And so the result really in this country has not just been mere segregation, but it's been the systemic extraction of wealth, right, and opportunity from Black and brown communities, and the creation of generational wealth for white families, right? And so again, I want to say that again, extraction, right, and creation, right? It wasn't just, you know, white folks just got housing. It literally has been a tool to expand the wealth gap in our country. And so, you know, these practices were hidden, right? They weren't hidden. They were often common and legal, and so this is really the context in which the Fair Housing Act of 1968 was passed. I think we'd be remiss also not to name that happened not for long after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, right? About the closest we've ever been as a country to enacting more socialist values, right, to really building a more multi-racial, multi-ethnic, multinational, multi-gender movement, right, towards civil rights in this country. So these things are connected. And so while this was a landmark achievement for our country, it was also incomplete, right? And it was incomplete because it was forward thinking. We'll stop discrimination, we will create policy to try to move us forward, but we cannot move forward if we do not reckon with the past and with our history, right? And so while the Fair Housing Act of 1968 banned discrimination, it didn't undo damage that had already been done, particularly in terms of generational wealth gaps. Segregated neighborhoods remained, right? Wealth gaps persisted, and discriminatory practices largely became subtle and underground, if you will, and harder to prove is real, right? So today we continue to see disparities in home ownership, access to credit, neighborhood investment that trace directly back to policies prior to the Fair Housing Act, right? And most importantly, the discrimination didn't disappear, it evolved, right? And the responsibility for addressing these inequities also shifted after the passing of the Fair Housing Act, right? Federal law sets the floor, but it really is on municipalities and the local level to shape the reality around housing. So let's bring this home. Let's bring it closer to Vermont. I think oftentimes when we have these conversations, particularly about the history and the legacy of chattel slavery, of racism, discrimination in this country, Vermont is often perceived and regarded as a place that is apart from this history. It's not. Vermont does have its own fair housing laws, as many of us know, which mirror federal protections, but also go further, right? Protecting people based on sexual orientation, gender identity, marital status, right, receipt of public assistance, and more, right? That expansion reflects a commitment to equity, but a commitment does not mean completion, right? It doesn't mean that we're done, which is often where the conversations in Vermont sometimes feel stagnated. Housing discrimination continues to happen even here, right? And the fact of the matter is that when we don't build policy with inclusion, with equity centered, right? That is not, while we're not doing it on purpose, right? The impacts persist, right? And so we think about things like, I have heard many times over the last few weeks in preparing for this talk, there are 13 Black families, right? People self-identify as Black who own homes in Burlington proper. That is very dismal. By my math, that is 0.1% of Black people who live here. Not on purpose, not our faults, but we must take responsibility, right? We think about things like the Champlain Housing Trust, which I know Maggie will speak to later. Great policy, we have great intention. When we don't make plans and we're not intentional about being able to adjust to the day and age in which we live, and considering who's most impacted, right? We can often do more harm than good. Shared equity is wonderful, and it is in some ways a detriment to wealth building for lower income families, right? Which again goes back to our historical realm. And so in some ways, some of our efforts, right, to advance housing here in Vermont have really perpetuated the historical realities of how we got here, right? And so sometimes, reports here of this, discrimination are not overt necessarily, right? But we do hear, and even in the Office of Racial Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging, we get calls from residents who are looking for help with harassment, denial of reasonable accommodation, right? And just unequal treatment. I was telling someone earlier that I moved back to Vermont in April of 2024, and was very surprised that I was unable to see apartments in Burlington. I tried about 5 or 6 before I just gave up and tried surrounding areas, but I would not be able to see apartments until I had paid a deposit and applied and was accepted, right? For better or worse, I might have understood that in 2021, right? But 2024, post-COVID, asked me to put on a mask, I could imagine someone with less resources than I'd had who would not have been able to apply to multiple places in order to get an apartment, right? I'm pretty sure that's not legal. I was in a rush. I did not have time to look into it, right? But it's something that I experienced that, again, made me question, is this where I want to be? I've never heard of such a thing, right? And so we have to think about how the barriers, how are we creating barriers, right? Unintentionally. Zoning codes determine where housing can be built and what types. Permitting processes influence who can participate in development. Infrastructure investments signal which neighborhoods are prioritized, right? I know that Rachel will speak later to the fact that our multifamily housing situation in the Old North End and in Winooski, right? A lot of these are properties they're not in great condition. So local enforcement determines whether protections are meaningful or symbolic. And even policies that can appear neutral perpetuate inequity, right? Large lot zoning, bans on multifamily housing in certain places, and procedural barriers often function as modern forms of exclusion, right? Limiting access by income and in turn by race. And like the rest of the country, Vermont is shaped by structural forces, zoning decisions, development patterns, and economic barriers that can limit who has access to housing and where. And even policies, that can appear neutral create what's called disparate impact, right, where outcomes disproportionately harm certain groups, whether that was the intent or not. And so the story of fair housing is not just about the law passed in 1968, but really about the ongoing struggle between exclusion and access and policy and lived reality. And it really asks us to confront a difficult truth, in my opinion. Housing has never just been about shelter. It has been a gateway to education, to employment, to safety, to health, and to generational wealth. And when access to housing is unequal, everything that flows from that is unequal. And so where does that leave us? It leaves us with responsibility and opportunity, right? Responsibility to name the history clearly, including the ways that discrimination has been built into the system or the ways that we understand that our previous inability to center equity and inclusion have created discriminatory systems, right? And really an opportunity to do more than just comply with fair housing laws, but to actively create communities where access, dignity, and belonging are real for every one of us. Fair housing is not just about preventing harm, but about building a future that is not determined, that you don't have to live just any place, any old place, based on who you are. So thank you so much.
No, you're good. That's tough to follow. Good evening, everybody. My name is Maggie Callahan. I am the Housing Program Manager for the Community and Economic Development Office, CEDO, for the City of Burlington. I will say I started the position in November, and before that, I was the Director of Investigations for the Boston Fair Housing Commission. So it's really exciting to be back in the fair housing world, be celebrating Fair Housing Month with you all. So tonight I'm going to be talking a little bit about what the City of Burlington, the housing team, what we're doing, what we're prioritizing, as well as talking about the mayor's housing strategy and how that is really interfold and intersects with fair housing and with equity, many of the points that Kelly just raised, and then also give my contact information at the end. This is a very brief overview of all of the programs that we oversee, and this is still kind of a small fraction of the work that we do. One of the big pieces of work that we do is manage HUD grants that we then give back out to the community in hopes of developing and expanding our affordable housing pool in the City of Burlington. As you can imagine, where the federal government is currently at, these programs, home, CDBG funds look a lot different. Some of the requirements look a lot different, but the City of Burlington's really committed to, regardless of what the federal government is doing, committed to making sure that we are expanding affordable housing in an equitable and just way. The other big kind of pool of money that we use to fund the development and preservation of affordable housing is through the Housing Trust Fund. And the Housing Trust Fund is great because the city runs it, owns it. We don't have any federal requirements attached to that. And so every year we usually do a round or so of funding for projects that are looking to expand, renovate, preserve affordable housing, as well as capacity grants for nonprofits that are looking to provide trainings, go to conferences, but are trying to build that capacity out for affordable housing as well. The third kind of big policy piece that the city housing team manages is monitoring our inclusionary zoning code. So City of Burlington, we're really proud that we passed the first inclusionary zoning protections across the entire country, and we're really used as a model that now the rest of the country uses. So in the City of Burlington, 5 or more units, you are required that one of those units be affordable. And the CEDO housing team, we make sure that that actually happens. And so we're monitoring every year, making sure that the rents are affordable, making sure that the people that are living in those units meet the qualifications and that we're really serving the population that these units are meant to serve. We also, every year, update the rent and income calculations that come from HUD when they publish the average median income and fair market rates. We go back, take a look at what Burlington is at, and then make those affordable housing rental limits. And then lastly is community engagement. We're constantly looking at new projects, new opportunities for housing, affordable housing, and always looking for innovative housing solutions. And so love to get input from the community. I always think the community always gives the best ideas because neighbors know really what they want to see. And so that is really what we're always looking for. In tandem with all of this, and kind of what's guiding and driving all of this, is the mayor's housing strategy that she released in January. It's a three-pronged approach focused on equity, stability, affordability, and also democratizing the process. The first focus of her housing strategy is revitalizing what she's calling our legacy tools. That's that inclusionary zoning law, that is our housing trust fund. Those are the policies we already have in place, that we've had in place for many years, but re-envisioning them, revamping them, thinking about how can we better serve the community in an equitable way. The second piece of that is activating the neighborhood code, which was passed in 2024, and that is with the goal and the idea that Burlington can't grow out, right? We're surrounded by other communities. Unless we want to start building houseboats on the lake, we have to build up or we have to build infill. And so the neighborhood code is really focused on that, thinking about ADUs, thinking about other smaller units, and thinking about how do we densify our neighborhoods. And so activating the neighborhood code is a priority of that. And I think at kind of the forefront of all of this, and when we think about equity, it's really making sure that the public sector is at the forefront and we are the leader in reclaiming our role as one of the major housing developers in the city. The public sector, a lot of them, CHT, a lot of these partners do really great work, but the city really has to be the leader in terms of dictating what we want to see, which is affordable housing, which is fair housing, which is housing access for all. And so by reclaiming our kind of role in that, we are going to make sure that that happens. The next slide is a quote from her press conference, but I think, I'm not going to cite the whole quote, but I think what's really important about it is just that equity is truly at the center of everything we do. And I think to Kelly's point earlier, making sure that our policies and our programs are centered on that is critical, because while you might not think about a policy's implications in the moment, if equity is not at the forefront of what we're doing, we're going to have negative side effects of that policy. And so making sure that really, as we're revamping these policies, as we are making sure housing is a priority for the city of Burlington, we're doing it in an equitable way. And I think to the last point, that's really how this intersects with fair housing. We want to make sure we're growing equitably. The statewide goal for Burlington is that we build 7,000 units by 2050. I can tell you that's a really lofty goal. It's an aggressive goal, but we want to make sure we're doing that in an equitable, just, fair way. We also want to be democratizing our process, and the way that I think about that, especially with many of the programs we have, is that we are opening it up to all people, not just people who are the typical, the people that we always think about, but the homeowner that has the garage in the back that thinks, oh, maybe I want to build that out. But democratizing it and opening up the process and opening up what the process looks like. How do we determine where the money goes? I think just builds in more equity so that we understand and so that the community is really involved. And then to the last point of all of that, including all voices, making sure that community input from renters, from homeowners, from landlords, developers, and our neighbors are included in every single conversation that we do. I can tell you, Kelly and I have been a part of the Bloomberg Harvard Innovation Leadership Program that the mayor, that the city of Burlington was awarded, that the mayor's been a part of as well. And that's really been the center of the work we've been doing, also with Ita over there, in terms of making sure that we're getting input from a diverse field of voices and getting people who maybe aren't typically at the table are coming to the table and are sharing their ideas. And so that's really how what we're doing right now intersects with fair housing. My contact information is on the next slide. Please feel free to reach out. I love hearing input. I love hearing feedback. It's what makes our work, what makes policy better. I think all of the policies, all of our programs is kind of living, breathing things that we're constantly evaluating, constantly shifting. And so do not hesitate to reach out. But thank you so much. And thank you all for being here. This is great.
Hi, everyone. Kalia here again. Nice to see you all. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to talk a little bit about my role at CVOEO and how we execute our education and outreach related to fair housing. Our education and outreach can be a preventative measure for illegal housing discrimination. Part of what we do can be a first line of defense for people who could be experiencing illegal housing discrimination. We do that by providing workshops for housing providers, service providers, and municipal officials. We also have Know Your Rights workshops that we do for the general public. And we have online trainings as well for people to be informed of what their rights, responsibilities, and obligations are under fair housing laws. So people can learn more about fair housing by reaching out to us directly to schedule one of those workshops or use one of our online resources. We also do lots of tabling and community events, and we hand out materials related to fair housing, one of which is in my hand. People can learn about what fair housing laws are, what the protected classes are. There are several protected classes in Vermont, 7 federally protected classes, which I will list for folks. It is prohibited to discriminate against people in housing based on membership in these classes, which include race, skin color, national origin, religion, family status, sex, and that also includes sexual harassment, as well as disability. And in addition to those federally protected classes, all states have to have enforcement for people who experience illegal housing discrimination based on membership in those classes, but states can elect additional protected classes. So in Vermont, we have several. And the newest elected class is actually citizenship status and immigration status, which was a really big fair housing win for us. And it is now prohibited for housing providers to require Social Security numbers on rental applications. I can go into the rest of them if people are curious, but I want to move forward with just sharing what services and resources that we have. We also support people who might be experiencing illegal housing discrimination, and we do that through one-on-one consultations, so people can reach out to us, whether it's directly or through our Vermont Tenants Hotline. And if it seems as though they could be experiencing a fair housing issue, then they'll get referred to us. We'll talk with them, figure out their housing situation, and help them discern between if they could be experiencing a fair housing issue or maybe a breach of Vermont landlord-tenant laws, which these things tend to intersect quite a bit. And then we'll talk about what could be the best next steps for that person. And we only would make suggestions for things based on what people are comfortable with. We're not attorneys, so we don't give any legal advice, but we can support people with doing a rights review. We can reach out to housing providers on behalf of people who might need support with exercising their rights or even informing housing providers of what their responsibilities are. We can write letters on behalf of clients or help people write their own letters to exercise their rights. And I also can assist people with filing formal fair housing complaints, which we have folks from both Vermont Human Rights Commission and Legal Aid here to talk more about what fair housing enforcement looks like. But in general, the education and outreach work that we do is crucial to fair housing as a whole, as people are unaware that they even have rights or that they could be getting discriminated against. So we're a great first stop for anyone who might be experiencing illegal housing discrimination or think that they might be experiencing illegal housing discrimination, and we can support them and refer them to the right places if we can't support them in solving their issues right off. So my presentation was a little shorter, so I'm going to pass it over to Big from the Vermont Human Rights Commission, and they can talk a little bit more about enforcement, and we can maybe later talk about the intersectioning of education and outreach prior to going into actually enforcing fair housing laws.
Thanks so much, Clea. Thanks for having me here today. My name's Big Hartman. I use they, them pronouns. It's my honor and pleasure to work for the Human Rights Commission. We're a state agency. Our mission is to advance full civil and human rights in Vermont. More than half of our cases involve fair housing, and so it's a topic that's really important to us. Let's see, what do I got on my slide here? Yep, okay, covered that. We have 9 employees. We have grown substantially over the last 3 years. years, and we're really happy about that because there's absolutely no shortage of discrimination complaints coming into our office every day. So we are primarily engaged with intake and investigation of complaints of discrimination, and like I said, most of those cases involve housing. We also do file lawsuits when needed, where the Human Rights Commission is actually the plaintiff in those lawsuits. We also engage in as much education and outreach as we possibly can, and it always helps to have our wonderful community partners to team up with on that kind of thing. And we also are involved at the State House trying to advance good laws and policies to protect our civil rights. And you can check out our website for more information about our process, and we have a couple of booklets down there at the tables. This is a little bit of an, yeah, you can go ahead. This is a little bit of an overview of our complaint process. It starts with intake, where people can call or email or just stop by our office and go through an intake process with us if they think they've experienced discrimination. And then if we are able to accept their complaint for investigation, we assign a staff attorney investigator who's going to talk to witnesses, gather documents, and also try to see if we can help the parties conciliate, which is a fancy word for settle the case, work out the dispute, get the reasonable accommodation granted, and allow folks to move forward. When we're not able to settle a case with parties, and keeping in mind that we are not representing either party in these cases, we are a neutral investigative agency, but obviously we're all fully committed to civil rights, and we really are a mission-driven team. So if we aren't able to help parties settle a case, which is very common, we will complete our investigation with an investigative report where we summarize the law, the facts, and how it, and we do a legal analysis with a recommendation about whether or not we believe that discrimination occurred. The commissioners, we have 5 governor-appointed commissioners. They meet once a month, and they're actually the ones who make the determination about whether or not there's reasonable grounds to believe that discrimination occurred. If they find that there was reasonable grounds to believe that discrimination occurred, we usually are able to settle a case pretty readily after that. But if we can't, we do have the ability to enforce that in court. And we have a full-time litigator who currently has, I would say, about 17 cases filed in court. So we're pretty busy. I think I have on my next slide some stats that I gathered for some legislative testimony for Fair Housing Month. Yeah, so I think in terms of the fiscal year, so this is data from July of 2025 through the end of March. On average, we receive at least 1 call or email about housing discrimination every day. We opened 70 inquiry files related to fair housing, and we conducted 57 fair housing intake meetings. Those are generally about an hour long, where our intake coordinator meets with an individual and hears more about what has happened. Of course, we cannot accept all of those complaints for investigation. We only have 4 investigators now, and but we accepted 24 new fair housing complaints in that time. And at the time of this, which I think the number's gone up since then, but 48 open cases related to fair housing. Some of those are in the investigation stage, some of those are post-determination, and some of them are in litigation. And so far in this fiscal year, we completed 17 fair housing investigations, and I know that number has gone up since then. I'd say there's about 3 more on that list. And out of those 17, 7 we found reasonable grounds to believe that discrimination occurred, and 3 cases settled without a determination. So our numbers are up. Our numbers have continued to increase in the 5 years that I've been with the commission. I think that was my last slide. Oh no, look, I got another one. This is just kind of an overview of like some of our common cases. Definitely the vast majority of our cases involve individuals with disabilities who have additional rights in housing. And so most of the cases involving folks with disabilities involve requests for reasonable accommodations, which is like a change in how the housing provider is doing something, a change in a practice or a policy or a rule that is needed for someone with a disability to use and enjoy their home. So that can relate to having an assistance animal, having a parking space, and other accessibility concerns. We also see our next highest kind of type of case involves race or color-based discrimination, national origin, and receipt of public assistance is a big category of housing discrimination that I think a lot of housing providers don't know, that they can't like refuse to consider you for housing if you receive Social Security income, for example, or if you have a housing choice voucher. We are doing a lot of education often with landlords about those requirements. We have definitely had a substantial number of folks file complaints with us or file an intake with us related to their low-income affordable housing program, or in folks who are in the hotel motel program. And we are really concerned about that and trying to focus our enforcement on those issues whenever we possibly can. So I'll be here if anyone wants to chat more about the Human Rights Commission work. But I'll just mention as I hand this over to Legal Aid's representative here that a lot of folks think we do the same thing. And even at the State House, I often have to explain to legislators that we do different sides of the work here. We are the enforcement agency, and Vermont Legal Aid has lawyers that represent individuals in our cases and in other types of housing disputes. So they get to do the advocacy work. I'll hand it over to you. Thanks.
So I'm Rachel Batterson from Vermont Legal Aid. I'm the director of our Housing Discrimination Law Project. I do not have slides, and I kind of hate them, but I do them sometimes. Anyway, I didn't tonight. I'll just carry on from what Big was saying to say that the way that things are different, when you call Big outfit, it's a little bit more like or it's analogous to when you call the police. So they assign someone to look into it, they go and they gather evidence, and then they present it to an attorney who then decides to prosecute or not. You go to the Human Rights Commission, you say someone discriminated against me in housing, they assign an investigator, the investigator looks into it, then they present it to the commission decides whether or not there was discrimination. So it's not, in those processes, when you go there as the victim, you aren't being represented by that agency. That agency is enforcing the law for everyone's good. And the difference is when you call legal aid, you're calling and talking to a private lawyer. And our job as private lawyers is defined in lots of things, but basically we represent you and we assert your interests. So there's a slight difference in emphasis. My job isn't to make sure fair housing laws are followed. My job is to represent my clients in asserting their rights. And that may be by going to the Human Rights Commission. It may be by having a conversation with the other side. It may be by filing a lawsuit in either state or federal court. What's different about that is that I can counsel my client, like, what do you want to do in your circumstances? What's going to make sense for you? If you do this, what are the likely consequences? Is that worth it to you? Those kinds of conversations where there's kind of a counseling of the person about what their goals are and what the law says so that they can make that informed decision. So it's just a different role, even though we're enforcing the same law. Does that seem fair?
Yeah.
So what was I supposed to talk about? I was supposed to talk about what it looks like when you do decide to bring a lawsuit. And I will say a lot of my people that call us and that we say we do look into it initially and we do some either investigation or testing. A oftentimes the people with the best cases decide not to pursue them. And that's because, for one thing, especially when it comes to race discrimination, people of color are so used to being discriminated against that they just are like, yeah, I'm glad you confirmed that that happened because that's what I thought, but I do not want to go through that again. Or my sister went through that and I do not want to do that. And it's a completely rational choice, and actually a choice that most people who have legal claims will take, because litigation is not fun. It's hellish. It lasts forever. You get dragged into processes you don't understand and you don't want to be in. And it also kind of tends to just keep that issue live for longer. Like you just have to live with it forever, instead of being like, that crappy thing happened, sorry, I'm moving on now. Because the legal process isn't really the greatest. It's the best we have for resolving disputes between people without, beating each other up. So it's better than that. But really what our whole legal process, especially on the civil side, is about it's money. So what are you going to get? You're not going to get an apology, definitely not a genuine apology. You're not going to get much in the way of changes. Even if they change things, you don't have a complete confidence that that actually will pan out, frankly. Sometimes it works, and sometimes you can monitor and it does work, but often it doesn't. So is it worth it to go through this whole thing to you in order to educate this landlord or realtor or whoever it is for not very much money and for a lot of heartache? So I'm like the bearer of bad news. We have this great law, but it actually, fair housing isn't self-enforcing, so either an individual has to go through all that in order to make sure the law gets enforced, or you have to have a government agency that's enforcing it because that's the right thing to happen. And that is a lot less onerous for the victim, because there's an investigator that's looking into it. They don't have to, in our legal system, in litigation, each side has to bring forward the evidence and present their case. When you go to the HRC, you are just saying, this is my version of the story, then they talk to the other side, see what's their version of the story, then they talk to other witnesses and gather other evidence. It's not as burdensome on the parties. And so it's a better way in many ways for the Fair Housing Act to be enforced. Was I supposed to talk about? I think that's what I was supposed to talk about. So I also just curious what people here think, and if you have any questions for any of us about what we do, or have experiences you want to talk about, or thoughts.
Well, first, I don't know if this one works. I think it works. First off, thank you all so much. I learned something new from all of you today, which is pretty wonderful. I really appreciate it. So I have a bunch of questions, but I'll just start with one. But before I ask a question myself, I just want to make sure that before anyone else leaves, if they have any questions that they want to pose, I don't want to, no? Okay, thanks for being here. So where's the potential? So we know that we have a housing crisis. We know that these laws exist. They're difficult to enforce. We know just because the laws are there doesn't mean that it's not still happening. There are challenges at the federal level. What are the opportunities on the state, but especially the local level, for fair housing enforcement? I'd love to hear your ideas.
I want to answer that one. So Vermont is actually lucky because we are not very developed in the land sense. There's a lot of open land still. Don't shoot me, everyone who loves trees. I love trees. I live in Huntington, by the way, so I definitely love trees. Why I say that is in so much of the country there has been redlining and there has been all of these things that have created segregation through public policy, through laws. We didn't have that in Vermont, but we do have a growing trend towards segregation in the Old North End and Winooski, and that has a lot to do with where we site below market housing. So if you put all of the housing that people can afford who have lower incomes, guess what happens? All the low-income people live there. And what else does that mean? Statistically, there's a high correlation between being black or brown and being low income because we have systemic racism. So if you build all the low-income housing in one neighborhood, you're creating, if not now, in the future, a segregated neighborhood. So you have to spread that out all around. And the good news is that you can do that in Vermont, and with all this emphasis on building, what we need to do is build housing that's affordable at all different levels everywhere so that people have a choice, because that's what fair housing is about choice of where you live. And you don't have a choice, realistically, if you can only afford to live in one place. So that's the positive.
And I think I just want to really emphasize a point that Maggie made, is that the mayor's, part of this, our housing situation is not just policy, but literally volume of housing, right? And so going along with what Rachel shared about just Vermont being underdeveloped, and there being opportunity, right, as we're able to balance it with caring for our environment, obviously. I think there is real opportunity here, and the Mayor Mulvaney Stanek definitely sees that and is trying to push that along for the municipalities, right, to really get ahead of this, because it can't be that it goes from a federal level to the people, right? That's not sufficient, right? We have folks out here doing work to help enforce the law, to help prevent discrimination, but we literally have a need here. We have missing housing in our community. So I'm really excited personally to see how our work at the conclusion of the Bloomberg Harvard City Innovation Program, how the work that we do and the continued work of the mayor really could fill in some of that gap across income levels.
I'll just kind of specifically add on that some of the things that we're looking at revamping, specifically inclusionary zoning, because that has been part of Burlington's laws since the 1990s, is to open up development everywhere. Currently, off-site units, payment in lieu fees are tied to certain areas. And there are certain neighborhoods in the city of Burlington that are excluded from being able to do that. So if you develop in that neighborhood, you can't do offsite, meaning you can't build elsewhere, or you can pay payment in lieu of the affordable house, of the inclusionary zoning unit. And so we're looking at what would it look like if we open that up? How would that impact gentrification? How would that impact redlining? I will tell you, my first week started in November, the first week of November, and my first week somebody had brought up this idea of opening up some of the inclusionary zoning, and coming from Boston, which is the most segregated city in the country, that was the very first question I asked, because my previous job, the Fair Housing Commission in Boston, we saw that every day. And so I think we're thinking about that really critically to make sure that, again, that we're not creating some sort of unintended consequence of making things more flexible, opening things up, but with the idea that we want to make sure that there's development in every neighborhood.
Hello. I just wanted to ask a question. Since you talked about like a lot of people are experiencing discrimination or not actually going forward with the law side, I was just curious if there have been people who've gone forward and what has helped them kind of persevere through that. And if we could tell more of those stories, would people feel seen in a way that encourages them to want to go through this? And then as more people do it, hopefully these landlords and people will take things seriously and want to actually stick to what they're saying. So I'm just curious if you've heard from people what's helped them get through that. Yeah.
Thanks. So some people do, and it tends to be people who maybe have a little bit more room in their life for that sort of battle and also feel really motivated. And I think just for me, my goal is to say, just be aware of what this road's going to look like so you don't feel disappointed later. I just, it's sort of being realistic about that and realizing how much of a toll it can take. Because if you go into it knowing it, that's different than if you just thought, you're just sort of going along in the process and you don't know that process because you don't do that every day. So I think the people that do pursue lawsuits tend to just have a very, to them, it's more about the justice aspect than it is about their particular thing or righting their particular wrong. They have a strong feeling that they want to make sure this doesn't happen to someone else. And those tend to be the ones that are able to withstand that long journey. I will, frankly, sometimes there are also people that just have more resources in every sense of the word. Because it's just easier for people with more resources to weather that storm. I don't want to discourage anyone from bringing a lawsuit. I'm just being realistic about it's a fairly big burden, but it can have very good outcomes and be educational for sure.
Yeah, I just want to add on to that, because our office also processes other types of discrimination complaints, and I think that there is a lot of strength that can be found through like a truth-telling process. I think folks can last in the process a little longer if they have an advocate. They need a way of taking care of themselves through the process. A lot of folks I've seen they have absolutely that eye for justice. I don't want this to happen to anybody else again. And they pray, they are connected to something higher and bigger than them. I think that helps sustain because there's so much challenges and barriers that the legal system erects for people to prove that they were discriminated against when we know it happened. And so it's really important to have supports that are there saying, no matter what anyone else says, like, we know what you went through, we know what happened. And then I think there's a patience that's required because it's so slow. It's such a long process. Our fastest investigations are getting done in a year. It's not ideal. And so some folks, we've seen a lot of folks file their complaint and leave. And they're like, okay, I'm going to be in another community where I'm not going to be around that anymore. Please keep working on my case, And they leave and they find some happiness somewhere else outside of Vermont or outside of the community where it happened. And that has helped them heal to have that space, I think. And then it's so important to have someone that will level with you that this is not going to be $1 million. This is not going to be a satisfactory, even if you go all the way and you win after a trial, you feel like you have been tortured. And so It's sadly true. That's why I think our process builds in this conciliation process to try to get folks to not have to be re-traumatized over and over and over again, having to tell that story. But it is a real toll, and we know for every case we accept that there's 25 more people that can't even pick up the phone, to try to have to go through that.
Yeah. Just one quick other thought is that while I do need to counsel the client about what this journey is like and how difficult it's going to be, how hard it is to prove discrimination in a court, that's different than me believing it. So I can, to some extent, be the person behind the scenes to my client. I'm saying, I hear you, I understand what happened, I believe you. I may not be able to prove it, but that feels a little bit different. And you have an ally in that process.
Okay, my name is Minnie Wilkinson, and I'm a content creator as well as I have a talk show, Hey Neighbor Hey, and a community person as well as a humanitarian. The question I have for both Vermont Legal Aid and Vermont Human Rights Commission, in the state of Vermont, particularly in the Winooski area, we have people from 85 different countries who live there. And I would like to just get a glimpse of your demographics of the cases that were even accepted or even got back a letter or anything acknowledged that even a complaint was filed, say, the last 6 months.
Okay, thanks for your question. I think I had up on my slide a little bit of the numbers of the most recent time I checked in the current fiscal year of how many new inquiry files we had created. We don't track people by demographics. We track, once we accept a complaint for investigation, we track the basis of the complaint, like what protected categories are implicated. And we at the inquiry stage, we track what type of cases. Is it housing? Is it employment? Is it public accommodations? I think, though, I don't think we have yet adequately reached the immigrant community. And I think that there's a variety of reasons that there's barriers there. We have been so under-resourced. There's not ideal language access right now, but we are improving that for sure. And now I think the fact that there is express, which just went into law in 2025, there's express legal protections based on immigration status and citizenship. We want those cases. We want to advance the law. We want to start getting case law about how that should be interpreted in Vermont. And so we are hoping that we will see more and more of those cases. I also think that there's a reality for a lot of folks that it's a daunting system, and some folks are scared of filing a report because they're fearful of retaliation. So we do have the option to initiate complaints where the Human Rights Commission is the complainant. And people don't always have to come forward, sign, put their name on the complaint, and notarize it themselves. If we get credible reports, especially if we hear things that are like affecting a large group of folks, we absolutely want to investigate those kind of things and are trying to use the tools available to us in our statute and rules to work on as many discrimination issues that are happening. But I think it's a really important question, and I also, though, wouldn't feel comfortable with everyone that contacts us for a complaint finding out, what their racial identity or, national origin is. As sometimes that's relevant, but sometimes it's not. Yeah.
So we actually are just starting up. We were closed. We weren't doing any housing discrimination work for about a year because we didn't have a grant. So we're just
because of the federal government.
Because of the federal government. So we are just starting up. So I don't have recent statistics, but generally speaking, we get about 100 complaints of fair housing discrimination a year, and about more than half of those concern, as Big said earlier, reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities. Of the remaining categories, I would say there's not a lot of race complaints, race, color, or national origin complaints, but there's I would say, a disproportionate to the population percentage. So I'm not sure that was exactly the question. I think maybe you were asking, are we serving people of color and immigrants? And to that question, I can say that we have looked at that sort of legal aid wide, and we are within, if you look at the population and the statistics, we do gather that information because various grant sources want to know that. We are serving people of color and immigrants. We provide free language interpreters to anyone who contacts us for legal services. So I think we're actually doing okay in that area, and a lot of people decide not to pursue their case for good reasons, but we are reaching those folks, I think. Always happy to hear from more folks, so please give us a call.
Thanks. Is it on? Okay. So Maggie, actually, I work in the same office as Maggie, and we were chatting earlier about, obviously I'm in the public health sector of this, about potentially, or like adding sort of healthy homes type thing, so lead paint hazards as a class. And I kind of couldn't totally wrap my mind around that. So I don't know if you have any opinions about sort of, now a healthy home is like a set of principles, but it kind of speaks to different things with income, or income, lower income housing, if you want to call it that. But just wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
So I don't think you would add that as a prohibited basis, but I like the thinking in general. What I'd love to see is landlords, particularly because if you own your home, you're responsible for what happens there, but for landlords to have some sort of certification process where they have to take a fair housing class, take a lead safety class, take a, all those things, so that it doesn't have to be onerous or long, but just like, oh, this is a thing, that would be helpful. The place that I've heard fair housing and the lead question come up is that in other states, Massachusetts, for example, they require remediation of lead. We require essential maintenance practices or something like that. So they have a much higher standard. You have to actually get rid of the lead completely. And in Massachusetts, the fair housing issue that has arisen is that some landlords don't want to rent to families with children, which is a prohibited basis, because they have lead and they haven't remediated it, and they don't want the exposure of the children to the lead, which is horrific and causes massive brain damage and is a huge liability for them. So they don't want to follow the lead law, therefore they don't want to, so they're going to violate two laws at once by not. Yeah.
I was just going to add, so to that point, so in Massachusetts, it is illegal to discriminate against a family if agreeing to either rent to that family or sell to that family would trigger that lead law. And so I was telling Sean how no housing discrimination case is fun, was good. But those seem to feel like some of the better cases because there typically was settlement conciliation of getting lead out of the unit, and those always seem to have the most like concrete finish in terms of the cases that we investigated. And so that's what I was telling Sean about.
I'll ask a question. Kind of piggybacking off of the earlier question, just regarding, how you can get more people to come forward with a claim and see that process all the way through. And so this is an enforcement question, both for Big and for Rachel. And it actually kind of goes to this question around lead and what Massachusetts is doing. That sounds great. I don't know, I don't think we do anything similar here in Vermont, but that sounds awesome. But to the enforcement piece of it, a lot of the people don't complete the process because it's not worth it. Are there other jurisdictions, other states that have created programs that make it worth it, whether that's, to the victim or just penalties to the landlord outside of, just the money damages that are owed? Do we know of anything that, seems to work in other places that we'd like to see happen in Vermont?
I am not aware of places that are doing a really great job with this. I think the legal process is what it is. We really pride ourselves on doing very thorough investigations, and I think we might be different than a lot of other states that do something a little bit more surface. We record our investigative interviews. Parties have access to their own files, which in a lot of other types of discrimination investigations, even those done by the Civil Rights Unit at the Attorney General's office, you don't get your file. You don't get to know everything that they found out in your case. And I think we do more comprehensive, robust investigations than most people. Is that also a downside because it takes longer? Probably. I think where there is room for improvement is with the conciliation process. I think that we should be settling more of these cases early on so people get the outcome that they need faster, and we are going to be exploring a more robust mediation program moving forward to see if we can get more cases so that we can accept more. If they can close readily with folks being mildly content with the result, that would be ideal for us, I think. I don't know if you know any models of other places that are doing it particularly well. Okay, good. Obviously the Boston.
There's just so many issues. So Boston, we used to do this. We got away from it when I became director of investigations. I wanted to go back towards this and got a lot of pushback. And then I moved here. But I wanted to report real estate agents to the real estate board and build some sort of system in terms of, and I whispered to Kelly, I was like, we need to shame more people. And so that was something that Boston used to do. I'm not sure what the real estate board, I'm not sure what they ever did with that information. But I think that should be tied to your real estate license. I think that should be tied to we talk a lot about like problem properties across Burlington and getting occupancy agreements. And we know we have people across the city that let their units just sit vacant and decrepit and they fall apart, and yet they're building something else. They're renting to other people across the city, and we have no mechanism right now to hold those people accountable. And so how do we tie it to occupancy agreements? How do we tie it to fees? And so I think if, and people might disagree with me on this, but I think if we flip it on that end, I would like to think that then we're actually preventing discrimination from happening because they know that we are, because it feels like so many times when you get cases, it's reactive, right? We're not actually preventing anything. And so how do we move towards a system that is actually preventing discrimination, or at least is preventing somebody from acting any sort of way?
Holding accountable. We lack some accountability here. We have good systems to address when problems arise, but we're literally not addressing the reasons that many of these problems arise to begin with.
Yeah.
And stop giving landlords sweetheart deals.
So I will say that both in the HRC process and in the litigation process, we do get those kinds of remedies, like affirmative marketing, or you have to, I once got in a settlement, you have to rent this apartment to someone in the same protected class within the next 3 years. So you can get those kind of remedies, and they're somewhat helpful. I think the basic problem is what Big said, is that our legal process is what it is, and it's essentially, its goal is, it's adversarial. So once you get into it, you're both making your best argument. There's just sort of a natural, a constructed reality to that world. And even if someone does have to do affirmative marketing or do it, if they're doing it, but they're thinking, as soon as this is over, I'm going to go back to my old life. I'm really irritated that I have to do this. The only way it really works is if you maybe actually educate someone and change their mind about things. And they actually, that just, in my experience, rarely happens. Sometimes happens in mediation, but it's rare. Mostly people are defensive. Mostly if you say, you discriminated against me, they then, I've had this happen in almost every mediation. The first thing out of the defendant's mouth is, oh, I couldn't discriminate because I'm gay, so I couldn't possibly discriminate against someone for being black. Like, how is that even relevant here? But that is the first thing that comes out. So you just, like, it's not a process that lends itself to conciliation in general. Or truth, true.
I'll just go off about trial a little bit, because I think trials are what we all look at as like, this is how we find justice, and trials are really about what evidence do you get in front of the judge or the jury. It's really not about telling the whole story and telling the whole truth. That's why I appreciate that we do have an administrative process to hopefully avoid people having to go through that trial with, where they're often disempowered, right? Because lawyers are the ones who run the trial and decide what goes in front of who and how we're going to pursue this legal theory, and takes a lot of the power away from the folks who are the ones who are impacted. So I love conciliation and settlement, because that's when you get a say and you can be creative. And we have seen apologies. I want to stick up for apologies. We've seen apologies in settlements mean a lot to people, even if they are not super heartfelt. But yeah, there's also other ways you can be creative in helping you feel like this person isn't going to discriminate again because they've gone through this. Yeah.
I have two questions, if that's okay. The first question actually relates, Rachel, to something that you had said in an email, talking about how racial discrimination in housing doesn't look the same in Vermont as it is recorded statistically nationally, and I would love to learn more about what that means exactly. I think you had said, like, the way that I've rephrased, the way that, like, discriminating in housing, like racial discrimination in housing is, like, manifests nationally, doesn't manifest that same way in Vermont, but there is a trend towards it now in, like, oh yeah, you had said something like that. And then the other question was something actually that Kalia, Big, and Rachel were talking about on the call about how Vermont is fighting back against some of the ways that the presidential administration is making fighting for fair housing difficult. And I would love to hear more about what y'all are doing for that as well.
Let me start with the first one, and then maybe I'll pass it to you, Kalia, for the second. So what I was talking about there is that nationally, so I said that there is a growing trend towards segregation in the Old North End and Winooski. Now, here in Vermont, in the Vermont context, we would say they're fairly segregated. If you compare those areas to areas right next door, if there's 0 or 1% people of color in, let's say, a certain part of the city, and there's 12% in the Old North End, that's a pretty strong difference. But if you look at that same statistic nationally, a 12% rate of people of color and white people is actually kind of, that's not really remarkable to them, because it's not like 80% people of color or something. I don't know what the actual national thing would be, but I've actually talked to national experts about this, and they're like, that's not segregation. I'm like, okay. So that's what I meant there. But what I think is important is that why I talk about it as a trend is that if we keep doing things the same way we're doing them now, we will have racial segregation in 50 years if we don't change what we do. So the good news is we have the chance to change things now.
Thank you for your questions, Katie. I can share a little bit about federal enforcement. The Department of Housing and Urban Development has changed their trajectory and priorities for how they are choosing to enforce fair housing laws at a federal level. And because we are an organization that receives federal funding, and other organizations, fair housing programs that receive federal funding, have to abide by these new regulations, which come with some parameters that limit certain ways in which that we can do education and outreach related to fair housing. And some of those parameters have been very difficult. And how we're fighting back more broadly, we're seeing that the Attorney General's office has done a lawsuit against HUD to try and support agencies that are receiving federal funding and how these parameters are affecting them. And I think Big can speak a little bit more on some successes that have come from that. But in general, it's difficult to fight against, and I think that's important to name, that although we all have constitutional rights to say what we want, depending on where your funding resource comes from, can come with caveats that can really limit what a group can say or do. So that is a challenge that fair housing programs around the country are facing, including ours currently.
So the way fair housing actually works in this country is that the federal government funds state and local agencies to do the investigations, like the Human Rights Commission. They don't pay enough for you to rely solely on federal dollars to do the enforcements, but that is how there is a nationwide network of agencies like the Human Rights Commission that do investigations and enforcement of fair housing cases. So in the past year, HUD started outlining new requirements to continue to participate in this program. Like, we've been a recipient of this program for, 30 years. And all of a sudden now they want to put new restrictions on what we do, including trying to have us comply with the executive order regarding gender ideology, having us agree not to do any DEI work, trying to tell us that we need to screen anyone who wants to file a complaint to make sure that they're in the country legally, and that we would refuse to issue any findings related to disparate impact. So those are things that we cannot do. We cannot live up to our mission and our state law requirements and comply with these new terms that HUD is imposing on us. And so we are really proud to live in a state where the Attorney General's office is willing to step up and challenge this, along with 15 other states. And we are hopeful that those lawsuits will be successful. And we are extremely grateful that when I've gone to the State House and told the appropriations committees that this is happening, they have stepped up and said, okay, we'll make sure you don't have a reduction in your operations because of this nonsense, this discriminatory nonsense that HUD is doing. And so we have been able to sustain our budget without relying on federal dollars this year, and that is the plan for next year as well. So, and I think as I talk to other folks in my position across the country, all of us are really committed to figuring out how we can continue or even increase our fair housing enforcement, recognizing that we no longer have HUD as a partner in that work, and folks need us more than ever. I said it without any expletives.
And I just wanted to add another thing, that historically fair housing laws have been broadly interpreted, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, and the current trajectory of HUD is to take on cases that have more blatant forms of discrimination. So I think it's important for community members to know how this is affecting them from the top down, that it is much more difficult to enforce discrimination cases that are based on things that Big just named, like DEI, disparate impact, diversity, equity, and inclusion, all of the things, unfortunately. But I don't want to disempower people by sharing that information, because I do think it's a really great time for us to be fighting back. And with my role in working with people and doing consultations, at the very least, one thing I can do is show up and be an ally and a support person. And a big part of what I do in conversations that I have is kind of cheerleading and rallying people to do what they can to exercise their rights. So even though some of the news that we shared might feel disempowering or disheartening, it's a better time than ever to be trying to exercise your rights, and I will be there to support you if you give me a call.
Thank you, guys. Actually, I had a lot of follow-up questions, but I'll stick to one. Rachel, when you were talking about like how segregation can look different, like nationally versus locally, I guess it's a question for anyone. If you know the feds, I guess you could say, are qualifying what segregation is nationally versus what it might be locally, does that affect how you're allowed to move? Do things have to qualify based on like federal standards before you can address things in a particular way? Or is there room for it to be like a very Vermont specific context?
So I should clarify what I was saying. There isn't some sort of federal law or regulation or guidance that says this is segregation at this percentage or that percentage. It's more like people's gut instinct based on cases. And so they're saying, what you're describing isn't what anybody else in the country would call segregation. That doesn't mean it's not a problem, and it doesn't mean we shouldn't work on it. And like I said, I think it's a problem just sort of growing. We're heading in that direction, and we should address it now before it is a problem. But it's not like there's some standard or some, So we can do what we want locally.
If no one else has any questions, we can give these lovely folks a round of applause.